usually it's just a matter of me uploading it to YouTube. But for whatever reason, when I went into YouTube on Tuesday night, it just sort of vanished, just kind of disappeared. So I don't know what happens. So I'm going to work on that. And unfortunately, since I record to the to this computer, I had to physically be here in order to go back and do the basically compress this to an MP4 file, then we upload it. And I thought the process was mostly complete on Tuesday, but apparently not. So I do have some work to do on that. So I realize I owe you a video, and I'll make that available. So what I want to do is just sort of go over, I do tend to, as we go throughout the semester, try to point out where we are and what, ending at week 2 today, and today is the 19th, right? And we're going to cover some of the rest of chapter 2 today. And we're giving out chapters 1 and 2 both. So as I think I've said to the class before, that it's in this introductory part of the semester, which is really sort of going to be ending today, because we're going to probably get into some new things. We're sort of jumping around a bit, but it's just really intended to sort of highlight for you some of the basics, some of the foundational topics of economics. And we're going to continue that next week with our demand and supply discussion. And I have no idea what to do to keep that light on, but I will do my best. And we'll try to get into chapter 3 before we leave. If we don't get there, it's not a big deal, because it actually wasn't forecast, at least in my plan, to do that until next week. But if we're running a little bit ahead of time, that's probably all to the better. We can certainly use the time, I think. And so if we get into chapter 3, that's great. I know there was no way we're going to cover all of chapter 3. So we'll be carrying this into next week. So next week begins week 3, if you can believe it. And chapter 3, and we'll continue that discussion into that following day. And if we move ahead a little bit, I don't think we will, but we may. But what I do want to do is to review for the first exam. And our first exam is scheduled for next week, right? So what I like to do prior to every exam is to have a bit of a review session, just to kind of go over some of the highlights, some of the things we've talked about that are relevant to the particular segment of the class. And remember, the first 4 exams are going to cover just the covered in that particular segment leading up to the final exam. Will have be much more comprehensive in nature, but for the most part, the first 4 exams will cover just that material. So that's the plan. We're going to get into chapter 2, chapter 3 today, and I guess I need to make a call to somebody to find out what I do about the lights, because I really have no idea what the lights are. I don't know what to do about it. And I know we were talking before the class began about how every room is different. And I know that this is the only class I have in this building. I've taught in this building for years, and I've never had a deal where the lights keep going off like there's some sort of haunted, like some sort of haunted classroom. So anyway, but right now I guess we don't really need the lights so much, because I just wanted to pick up from where we sort of left off on Tuesday, and that was we had talked a bit about the factors of production. Does anybody have any questions about that for anybody who was here, or anybody on the Zoom call who's able to sort of in real time have any questions? And feel free, if you do, if you're on the Zoom link live, you can either give me a shout out at any time. Really, there are only a few people on the Zoom link, and a handful of people here, so it's not as though there'll be a cacophony of voices, but feel free to do that. Or if you really would rather, you can type something in the chat box, and I'll look at it. I may not be getting to it right away, but I'm pretty close to it, so I'll see it. So we finished that. We talked about, and remember, this whole business about where we are in this class is we're sort of talking about the who, what, when, where, why of economics. And so we talked a bit about the who's last week, the 3 actor groups: business firms, households, and governments. We talked a bit about some of the what's, and that's how some of these are some of the hows, and that is the factors of production. Now, inputs basically are corralled to produce outputs, and we categorize those in these 4 different categories. We'll talk a little bit about what's here, and we've sort of touched on this a little bit. That's the idea of goods and services. So as we get going throughout the class, and not too long from now, we'll get into sort of breaking into the national, what we call the national income accounts, that will sort of break out for us what is all the production that's going on in the economy. Because of the $24 trillion or so excuse me, they're producing the economy. What is it that we're producing? And the question is, we often refer to them by the term goods and services as if they were one thing, as if they kind of went together. But in fact, there are differences between those. And we'll talk about what those differences are. So goods and services, is there a difference? So first of all, when we talk about goods, one of the main things that we should stress is that goods tend to have a physical substance. And so they're, you can put them on a pallet, you can put them on a truck, they can be burned up, shoplifted, whatever. They also can be inventory. That is, you can really account for them. And by this idea of the inventoriable nature means that essentially value is created and set aside until that value is released through a sale to some sort of downstream customer. And by the way, we need to be thinking about production of value as being a long chain of value that starts with raw materials. In the case of goods that have a physical nature, and the output of those raw materials makers then becomes the input to somebody else. So a coal producer, for instance, if you're mining coal, that's your output. But then it becomes an input to an electric company that then uses electricity, that's their output. And then that output of electricity becomes an input to the manufacturer who uses it to power machinery and computers and lights and all that. So it's a chain of value. And I think that one thing that came out of the pandemic that may be a good thing, there weren't too many good things, I don't think, it may be good, is that the average person got a little bit exposed to this whole concept of supply chain. And I think all of us probably witnessed shortages of certain goods as the pandemic got underway, simply because of the fact that we're a global economy tied together. And, a lot of labor was simply taken off the board with the pandemic because they either couldn't work or were locked out or prevented from coming to work. Particularly a lot of the goods that came from Asia, which was where the pandemic sort of got going. And yet, there were long difficulties in getting goods, across the ocean. We even saw it here at CW because we were waiting on some technology, some hardware, and we were wondering where it was, and we think it was probably on a ship somewhere crossing the ocean. So go ahead.
Didn't we have a collapse too during the pandemic?
Collapse? The economic collapse? Well, we did, and that's a good question because we're going to get into this whole idea of business cycles a bit, not too long from now. And we're going to see that we did have a bit of a dip in the economy, a recession. It was a very brief one, very short, about a 2-month recession. And in some people's minds, that doesn't qualify as a recession because for whatever reason, a recession has, in the minds of a lot of people, particularly the business world, has to be 2 consecutive quarters of declining output, that is output of goods and services. However, that's not the way the government defines it. And we're going to talk about that difference. If a downturn is a downturn, even though it's only 2 months, not 2 consecutive quarters, which would be 2 3-month periods.
I remember watching the news and seeing them dispute that. What's the real
definition
of a recession?
Right, exactly. What is the definition of recession? And I think a lot of people don't realize it. In fact, I would dare say probably a lot of economists don't realize it. In fact, I saw an interview with our former Treasury Secretary, Mary Summers, who said, look, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is not really governmental, but as was formed about 100 years ago, is by academics in Massachusetts to sort of time these business cycles. They've never defined it as 2 consecutive quarters of declining output. So I think we did have a bit of a mini recession that would have become more serious and more prolonged probably had the government not intervened. And a lot of governments worldwide did. So a lot of us sort of saw the value of that coming to us in the form of stimulus checks, and businesses certainly did as well. So yes, we all got sort of familiarized a little bit, maybe in the wrong way, but nonetheless familiarized with the idea of supply chains and the fact that we've got these linkages. And what's very interesting is I think it points out to people the idea of how fragile these supply chains really can be. And it's really sort of a daisy chain of value. If you take a good that's got any sort of complexity at all, where it's got inputs coming from all over the place, then you can see some real bottlenecks in production if you're waiting for, I don't know, an electronic component from Korea or from South Korea, and it's got to get to California before that final product can be made. So it's just sitting around waiting for production. Meantime, everything gets backed up. That's the fragility of supply chains. This is also what companies have in the last several decades been working a lot at, as trying to coordinate these supply chains, trying to coordinate when those raw materials or intermediate goods, whatever you want to call them, arrive at the receiving dock and when they can be processed and when they can be sent out. And so you have as little inventory as possible, because inventory, and for those of you who take an accounting or will study accounting or finance for that matter, inventory doesn't really do you anything but tie up resources. And inventory sitting around is not a good thing for anybody. So that's an issue. But so we talk about physical goods, we're talking about things which can be inventory. That is, they're countable, they can be stored, they can be moved around, they can be lost, whatever. Now, one interesting thing about it is there tends to be a lag time between production and consumption. Whatever the final consumption of that is, there tends to be a lag period. So even something like perishable goods, there's a reason why firms have tried to extend the life, particularly of things like food and beverage items, to do their best to keep them fresh, because they know there's going to be a lag time between the production goods, because they're inventoriable in nature. And so as a result, obviously, if you can extend that period, you can allow yourself a longer lag time to deal with things like supply chain bottlenecks and transportation issues. And by the way, we don't so much see it in this part of the country, but there are parts of the country in which this idea of lag time becomes more problematic because of weather. And I come from the upper Midwest, and I can tell you that there are a lot of times when the weather gets so bad and trucks aren't moving and whatnot, that there becomes a concern over whether or not prescription medicines are going to arrive, food products or whatever. Yeah.
I grew up in Alaska, so
How
everything
did you-
was shipped back to
Oh, so you're familiar with the whole issue then. They've got even more complex.
waiting for 3 weeks for something.
Oh, I'm sure that Alaska, right. And it was in Alaska. And I'm familiar with the fact that a lot of people fly things around because
Prices of everything is like
Oh,
$40 more.
yeah. Yeah, in fact, he was here over the summer and was marveling at the prices of things. Even though he's from here, he sort of forgets. But I can recall my brother, one of his first jobs out of college was in a town in upstate New York, about 8 miles from the Canadian border. And he said, here before he got there, they had a snowstorm of several feet, and that it was so impassable. And even though they're sort of equipped to deal with that kind of snow, it was just so monumental that literally there was some worry that the stores were going to run out of goods and that no one was going to have food because this thing lasted for a good 2 weeks. And that's how difficult supply chains are. And so even if we had something like a strike that didn't move trucks, we'd have a difficult, that's how fragile these supply chains tend to be. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about physical goods. Now we're going to sort of eventually say that the difference between these is irrelevant. But right now, let's focus on what some of the relevant differences are so that we can know specifically when we get into these national income accounts, the differences between these and why it's important from a standpoint of trade. What about services? They have little or no physical substance. So for instance, if I I went to the doctor the other day, just did my annual checkup, and I paid my copay. I don't know what the actual bill was, but I paid my part, walked out. You would not know that I had acquired medical services, right? I don't have anything physical. I didn't put the book in my car. I'm not moving it around. I didn't say to my doctor, go ahead and get started, and then I'll pick it up on Thursday, right? I've got to be there. You got to be present to win, so to speak. So there's little or no physical substance. If you're going to get your tax returns done, you pay your accountant $400, you walk out with pieces of paper. Well, you didn't pay $400 for pieces of paper. You went there to have the actual service done. So whatever physical substance tends, not always, but tends to be mostly incidental and irrelevant. And these goods cannot be easily inventoried. So it is difficult. I know it sounds like an absurd scenario where I tell my doctor, check up and I'll pick it up later, like it's dry cleaning it. Yeah, obviously it doesn't work that way. There's no real way to move it around. My doctor can't ship can't ship it on a truck to me or anything like that. So these are not inventoriable goods. And they tend to be produced and consumed at the same time. There are some differences here. Obviously, you drop off your tax data or information at the accountant, and it's pretty relatively quickly, but there is some lag. Also, things like research and intellectual, there can be a bit of a lag, but for the most part, the vast bulk of services are produced and consumed at relatively the same time. I hire a landscaper to come over and trim my hedges and cut my grass. He's producing it while I'm consuming it at more or less the same time. It's not inventoried. He's not shipping it to me, not UPSing it to me. It's done more or less at the same time. Okay. So think about this. And I want to sort of pose this to the class because it's been a long running conversation, I think, in our economy for a long time. And that is the differences between goods and services and whether or not one is more important than the other or has primacy over the other. In other words, is one of the big leagues, is other the minor leagues, right? Because I can tell you, and maybe I'm a little bit jaded in the sense I come from the upper Midwest, which is a big manufacturing country. But you know, there's this idea that producing stuff is more important than producing services because these are sort of the you know, sort of the rink-dink things that are particularly valuable and that you can't store them and there's nothing to see at the end of the day when you've produced it. You know, we heard this a lot. I can't see what I've produced and whatnot. So this was sort of the major leagues. This was sort of the minor leagues, at least in people's thinking. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on that subject? Is that an unfair characterization? What do you think?
I think it is unfair because I think you can't, I think both contribute to having, you can't have one without the other. And I think you need to have your experience heightened by something. So services tend to do that and enhance the human experience.
Right. I think without services, we're missing a big part of the economy. Let me just pose another question to you. When it comes to these production of goods and services, which of these parts of the economy, and this is just from a production side of the economy, which of these is growing faster, production of goods or production of services? Production of services. We're producing a lot more services. And that's not a bad thing, particularly for those, and I know that for those who would argue that services are the minor leagues, it's less important, we can't see what we produced and whatnot. Really the production of stuff is, you know, airplanes and computers and cars and trucks and all that. But really services are growing faster, and that's a good thing. Plus, a lot of these are fairly high wage occupations. I know that sometimes, like pretty much all the professions, engineering, services and healthcare services, legal services, etc., financial services. I know that we hear a lot about service occupations being low paying, but they're also very high paying in many cases. But here's the thing, here's the kicker. In economics, we don't distinguish between a value of production of goods or value of production of services. If it's $1 production of this, it's equal to $1 production of this. It's the very same thing. And in fact, when we get into talking about what to do about economic downturns and economic deficiencies, one of the big theories that came out in the 1930s, that, you know, the time of the Great Depression, was it really made almost no difference what production happened. And it's almost like it doesn't really make any difference at the end of the day what is produced, because $1 of output is $1 of output, whether it's a car or whether it's, you know, a haircut. It's the very same thing. Because why? Because that dollar becomes income to somebody else who then spends it on some other amount of spending, and that becomes income to somebody else who then spends it around and around it goes. Yeah. So
when we get to economic cycles, will we discuss the World Economic Forum?
well, we can a little bit. And one of those topics, the World Economic Forum, was this question, which is currently underway in Switzerland. They meet every year at this time in the winter time. I suppose that's not an accident, so people can ski and mingle and talk and all that. That's sort of
my question was, did that switch, that now that services are being produced more, was it at a time that goods were produced more?
They're both being produced more. It's just this is growing faster. Yeah, services are growing faster. So, but when we talk about the way that we conceive of macroeconomics, and a lot of it came from the work of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who we're going to talk quite a lot about in this class. His argument was it doesn't make any difference what's produced as long as it's produced. And his argument was during the Great Depression, obviously we had double-digit unemployment, and then some. I think the unemployment rate in the U.S. throughout the early part of the 1930s was about 25%, which is shocking considering right now it's 3.5%. So it's a factor many times higher than what it is today. Of course, we're in a different place today, clearly. But he was arguing that, look, we just need to produce output, and my spending is your income, your spending is my income, and that what we need to do is generate activity. We need to get going and do things. In fact, he argued that it doesn't really matter what we do. In fact, he argued that you could hire 100 people to dig a hole, in the first shift and then hired other people in the second shift to fill the hole back up. And it didn't really make any difference because it's the dollar that goes to those laborers who then turn that into spending. Now, obviously, that's an absurd example, which would be better to produce some real output, but it doesn't make any difference. But one other thing that's important, and this will come up very soon when we get into national income accounting, and that is because services are growing more rapidly than goods, that's actually a good thing because the US is exporting more services abroad than it's import a heck of a lot more physical goods than we export. So we have a deficit here, which means that we owe the rest of the world more for stuff they send us, which is a drag on our economy. And we're going to talk about this more. And I really wish that we had more time to talk about things like international institutions, like the World Bank and all that. But we will talk about international trade. But every time we buy an imported good, we're actually tapping the brakes a little bit on the US economy. And I say that not to sort of lay down the guilt trip on us, because all of us drive cars and burn gasoline and have bananas and jewelry and
We like cheap things here.
yeah, we like sugar and there are things that we just don't make here that we like to have, right? I'm not talking about necessarily even imported wine or whatever. We're just talking about things like sugar and oil. So we've got a deficit here, but we've got a big surplus here because we sell a lot more abroad. Meaning the rest of the world pays us a lot more than we pay the rest of the world for this category of services. And so that's a boost to the economy. Because what do we sell to the rest of the world? Things like healthcare services, financial services, entertainment. This has been forever the world's leader in entertainment. Well, not forever, but I mean, to the point that we have been able to market it abroad. So really, you can't say, I don't think, from any kind of rational viewpoint, that services are minor league sector. Excuse me. I'm not sick, and my asthma kind of gets the better of me. So I don't really think from a rational perspective that this distinction is that critical. Okay. So having said all this, having had this long discussion now about the differences between goods and services, I will tell you that as we go throughout the class, we'll be using the term goods as sort of a euphemism for goods and services both. Okay. Until we get to this part of discussing, we'll be breaking into the national income accounts where we start to look very specifically, sort of on a line item basis, at the actual by the government on a quarterly basis as to what we're actually producing. And for economists, we like to get these reports because it allows us to sort of tear into them and see what's actually going on in the economy, in particular, what's going on with the rest of the world. And we'll talk about this idea of trade surpluses, trade deficits, and what the whole nature of surpluses mean even in the first place. Okay, so we'll use the term goods as a euphemism for goods and services, unless we're being very specific as we go forward. Okay, all right, so questions about that particular issue there. Okay, well, let's move on to talk about, oops, I didn't quite get it. There we go, types of goods, okay? Types of goods. So there are different types of goods, and again, the term goods here could be used expansively to include services as well. But we like to put these types of goods together, what we call dichotomous pairs. Dichotomous meaning they're opposite one another, but they're paired together because there's a relationship between one another. So you can think of them as positively and negatively charged particles, if you like, or however you want to look at it. They're opposites, but they go together because they're linked in terms of their opposite relation to one another. And so these pairs go together. And by the way, if you end up taking microeconomics, we have an even broader expansion of this to include some goods which are produced by government and some which are not, and all that. But we're not going to go quite that deeply here. But we will talk about particularly the second pair a lot more in depth. So what is the first pair here that are dichotomous? It's called substitutes versus complements. So substitute goods are those goods which can be relatively easily exchanged or swapped or preferred over another for another good in a purchase decision. So think about what we're talking about. And by the way, what would be a driving factor in somebody as a buyer deciding to choose some other good? I don't want to buy this good because why? What's one obvious factor, one limiting factor? price, right? I don't like this good because the price of this good. And I know that we're sort of conditioned to think of these substitutes as being brand substitutes, things like Coke and Pepsi, right? I think a lot of us are probably indifferent between buying Coke and buying Pepsi. They're more or less the same good. I know those are fighting words. Some people, I get that. But for the most part, it's if Pepsi's on sale and it's $1 cheaper for a 12-pack of Pepsi than for Coke, that's one substitute that you can easily make and it'd be easy. But that's the most obvious one. Instead, what we're talking about are goods which are not alike. That are not alike. It's things like the price of, I don't know, the price of corn is rising. So let's not buy corn, let's buy green beans, right? Price is often a driving factor for these demand decisions. And corn and green beans are not alike at all. They just share the same characteristic of being a vegetable, right? Or chicken and pork, or beef and turkey. These are goods that are not the same, but they can be swapped out for others in some sort of decision, oftentimes price being the motivating factor. Okay? So these are goods that are swapped. The complements, on the other hand, are goods that go together in the transaction. Or if you buy one good, you're probably going to buy another good. Now, why is this important for economists to know, and why do we care? Well, often, and in fact, it's not just, but business people are very definitely interested in this. And that is, there are some goods that simply go together. So what are two goods that go together? If you buy one, you're probably going to buy the other. If you're going to buy golf clubs, you're probably also going to buy golf balls, right? And everything that goes along with that. And anybody's ever played golf, there's an endless series of goods that go along with that, right? If you buy a tennis racket, you're probably going to buy tennis balls. So it's something like if you buy hot dogs, you're going to buy hot dog buns, right? In fact, would you buy hot dog buns without buying hot dogs? I mean, you could, but does anybody? I don't know that.
It's like batteries go with everything.
Yeah, batteries are complementary goods, and sometimes they come with the product, sometimes they don't. There are goods that just simply make sense. They go together. You would buy them either because they're integral to the good itself, or they actually go together. I mean, you could buy hot dog buns, I guess, put peanut butter on them. I don't know that anybody does that. It's fine to do, but you don't do that, really, do you? And I bring this up when we talk about this as a point of interest to business people. When I was a commercial lender in banking, we had a customer that made hamburger buns. That's what they did for a living. And so we thought, okay, great. You know, people are always going to buy hamburgers. It's a very stable business, and we like to lend money to that. We like to lend money to stable businesses with a product that everyone's going to buy. Well, then we had some sort of scare on E. coli, which was an infectious disease that was, transferred by beef, and could be fatal. So there was this big scare that people weren't buying beef as much. And the government was recalling beef shiplets and whatnot. And they really started to say, oh, well, if you're not going to buy beef, you're not going to buy hamburger buns, for the most part. And I know there are substitutes for beef and hamburgers, but that's not what they were worried about. They were worried about the fact that there was this downturn. Now, fortunately, that E. coli outbreak got under control. It was mostly in another part of the country, but they were very concerned about that. So they had nothing to do with production of cattle or beef processing or anything, but they were impacted by that simply because they produced a good that was complementary to another good. And so they're sort of along for the ride. This is important. This interconnectedness between actors in the economy, even on the supply side, is important because things can happen that impact you as a producer, and you have really nothing to do with it. And if you need any evidence of that, obviously the pandemic is one of those. I personally think that probably not too many people did a lot of planning for a pandemic to happen, And I think this is really a challenge for the business world. Certainly it is for the economics profession. How do we make plans for these strange events that happen that are so devastating to an economy, or have the potential to be devastating? If you think of the September 11th terrorist attacks, for instance, I was still working in the financial world at the time and doing some part-time teaching when the September 11th terrorist attacks happened. And I can remember the next day, we had a conference call with my boss saying, well, our budget for the next year is up because we don't know what is going to happen. So we had just finished budgeting. It was the fall. We had just really finished budgeting for next year. And he said, well, forget it. We're going to have to think about it later until we know what the effects are going to be. In fact, it threw the economy into a downturn simply because of the fact that resources are being shifted in other places in the economy, and people were sort of reluctant to travel and whatnot. And so all those things are issues that arise. The housing crisis that became a full-blown financial crisis. How do we protect these kinds of things that impact all of us? So substitutes and complements are goods which are related in the sense that they are working a bit opposite one another. And if you're a substitute for one good, you cannot also be a complement. You're sort of fenced in either one or the other. However, you're not fenced in from being a substitute that's also a normal good or a substitute that's an inferior good. Let's talk about what this second pair is, which, by the way, is probably, for our purposes in macro, more important than the previous pairing. So normal goods are so called because they act like the way we'd expect them to normally act. Goods for which the demand is directly correlated with income. As people's incomes go up, they tend to demand all of them. As people's incomes fall, they demand fewer of these goods. That simply makes sense, doesn't it? So all luxury goods, for instance, are normal goods, because as we earn more income, we can afford more luxuries, right? So all luxury goods are considered normal goods. But it isn't just confined to luxury goods, it's most goods, hence the name normal goods. And think about this, it even extends to the life cycle of individuals. So let's say all of you graduate from here and go on to get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree and get really good jobs. And what are the things that you're going to be demanding more of as your incomes rise, right? You're going to demand more what? Well, yeah, loans needed to finance some of those, but maybe a bigger car or maybe two cars, a better place to live, a bigger place to live. If a bigger place to live means spending more electricity, more on insurance, you buy more clothing, you're going to buy more leisure and travel, you're going to buy better food, all these kinds of things, because your income is going up. And that makes life cycle. And as you get to retirement age, you're going to sort of dial it in a little bit. If you have children, they'll be moving out, they'll be gone, presumably. It's not always a given, but it does, that's the expectation. You take your house, the 4-bedroom house, you dial it down to a condo or an apartment, because your income is falling. You don't need, your needs aren't as much, and you don't need fancy cars when you're elderly and you've got other kinds of concerns. So these goods move with income. They also move with consumers as they change their aging process. But that's a little bit of something we'll get into a bit later. So normal goods are directly correlated with income. Okay, and they go up and down. So if incomes fall, we reverse the process. So think about this, and let's forget about the life cycle sort of issue. Let's say you're working and your employer has cut your hours. So you're working 40 hours per week, now you're working 30 hours. So your income is going to go down. So what are you going to dial down in terms of your demand? Simply because your income is falling. Normal goods, you're going to go to the movies less often, probably, right? Or maybe you're going to pick a substitute. Remember, you're not fenced in here. You could be a normal substitute. So rather than go to the theater, you might do what on Saturday night? Yeah, watch streaming or something, right? Maybe catch something on Netflix or something like that, or do something less costly. Rather than go to dinner, what you might do, maybe order pizza or something like that, right? So those goods where the demand picks up as income falls are called inferior goods. And the term inferior is probably an unfortunate choice. I didn't make it up, but it's been around for a long time. Because less superior than other goods like normal goods. And I think that's unfortunate, and particularly when we start naming names and whatnot, people get sometimes offended. But it is the term of art that's used. These are goods which the demand was opposite income. So think about this. So something like substituting, and by the way, all inferior goods are substitutes for normal goods. And so as a result, you are always swapping out an inferior good for a normal good as incomes are falling, for instance, okay? And so as a result, they're almost always substitutes. And there are some of these that are pretty obvious. So things like generic goods are almost all inferior goods, right? Does it make any difference to you whether if your income is being pinched because your hours are being cut, or maybe your spouse is facing some difficulties and maybe not getting the overtime or the bonuses and all these kinds of things that maybe last year you got? Well, then maybe it doesn't make any difference. Rather than pay $350 to buy Reynolds Wrap Albertsons maybe pay $1 to go to Dollar Tree, right? Is it qualitatively the same? Maybe not. Maybe there's a qualitative difference. Sometimes not. And in fact, with generic goods, what is the dirty secret about generic goods? A lot of times, who makes those generic goods in the first place?
The original.
The company that makes the actual good. Sometimes they don't even bother to change the address on the label, and they're right next to each other on the shelf, right? Like for instance, Pert Plus was for years the best-selling shampoo in the country in a bright green bottle. I think most of us have probably seen it before. And then there's a generic that goes down or maybe down a little bit, and it was also a bright green bottle, but it had the same address, made by Procter & Gamble, but it doesn't say Procter & Gamble, and it doesn't say Pert Plus, but it goes for a lower price. Now, why on earth would a company that's selling shampoo at $4 per bottle or whatever, want to now sell it $2.50 per bottle at the retail? Why would they do that? Why would they cut their own throats to do that, do you think? Why would you want to do that? Because if you don't do it, somebody else is going to do it, right? So you might as well get that business. There are some people who are not motivated by brand and who are not impressed by it. And so as a result, will buy goods if they're cheaper, because it becomes all about price, particularly if they are considered to be an inferior good where your income is already going down. And so you want to buy the substitute good. Now, there are some people who are just the opposite. My daughter is very brand sensitive. She gets really offended if you don't buy something that's got a brand that she recognizes. So I saw, well, you're sold, you're hooked on that. So, but that's an argument for another day, I suppose. But there are goods that are swapped out for others. Now, why does this matter macroeconomically? Because if we see the demand for inferior goods rising, then we are noticing there's an inflection point happening. Here's the thing about macro that is interesting. It's also, I think, sort of aggravating, and that is it's been likened to driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror. All the information that we get, for the most part, is historical. Some of it may be very close in time, like last week's jobless claims, for instance. That sort of thing. But that's still historical. It was last week. Is there a big difference between last week and this week? Probably not. But what about total goods and services in the economy, where we get a quarter's worth of information about a few weeks after that quarter is ended? So this quarter we're in now, the first quarter, January through March, we'll get data sometime late April, early May for things that are happening today. So it's historical information. So the sooner we can get information on what's happening, people are buying more inferior goods. That tells us there's something happening in the economy. And so, for instance, when the financial crisis first began back in 2008, 2009, we saw a lot of demand for certain retailers that are associated with the marketing of inferior goods. We saw the sales of Family Dollar and Dollar Tree and Dollar General rise dramatically. Why? People were using them as substitutes. We saw a demand for goods such as steakhouses go down, and we saw the demand for Burger King and Wendy's go up, right? So those are considered inferior goods. And I say that, I know that people might say, hey, I like Wendy's. What do you think? What do you mean inferior? Well, that's, again, I didn't make the term up, so don't shoot the messenger here. But that's considered an inferior substitute for a normal good. Unless people's incomes are crimped, they'll defer the luxury good and go with something a little bit more down market. So it's a telltale sign of what might be happening, right? When the switch to inferior goods happens. And again, business firms are very savvy to this and know very often this is why they produce the generics, both to keep their competitors off the shelves, given the fact that shelf space traditionally, particularly in the brick and mortar retail environment, is fixed, at least in the very short run. Now we're in more of an internet economy. It's not quite the same, but it's also capturing that market of inferior goods.
And the cause and effect of normal goods, or at least with brand name businesses, because of marketing, their prices are
right, exactly. Marketing is what supports brand strength. And for those of you who want to take micro, you'll definitely get into this, where the issue is that these brands are supported by advertising and marketing, and they carry a premium price. And it's not a bad thing. I know I sort of joke around about my daughter preferring only brand name items, but we're all sort of creatures of that, because we know that we buy a good and pay a little more for a brand name good because we know exactly what it is.
We trust the brand.
We trust the brand. We know exactly what it is. And there was a famous story that I read in the Wall Street Journal years ago where Anheuser-Busch, which produces Budweiser beer, had a batch of Budweiser that there was something wrong with it. It just wasn't perfect. And they had to pour a bunch of beer down the drain. And it made the local people saying, hey, wait, don't do
we'll
that.
drink it.
Yeah, we'll take it. We'll take it. It's like, no, you really can't take that. It's not really ready to drink. We know it's not good. We know, but they don't want to put bad Budweiser on the shelves because people think, I mean, if you drink a Budweiser, I think you expect it to be like the Budweiser you had last week, and it's always going to be the same thing, right? By the way, this is where Coke stubbed its toe very badly about 40 years ago when they came out with new Coke.
Oh,
They thought they were being very clever by coming out with a brand new product because they were getting lots of competition from Pepsi. Turns out research showed people liked a little bit of a sweeter drink. So they came out with new Coke, and oh my gosh, I can remember that the backlash was ferocious. So
people switched to Pepsi too at that time, didn't they? A lot of people.
well, I think people did. I heard people reporting. I remember there were stories of people who would just wipe out the supplies of Coke on the shelves. By the way, it took Coke years to undo the damage, and they came out with Coke, what they call Coke Classic, which was the original formula. And then they retired that name. That name sort of quietly went away, but it took years. And I think sometimes you might see the term original formula and whatnot, but it's considered really one of the marketing blunders of the age. And it sort of made its way into business school case studies of maybe what to do differently. Don't mess with the brand. Messing with a brand is a very bad thing. And even if it's something that, it could be better, and they thought they were making a better product, people like what they like. So these are types of goods. And so from our standpoint is, in a macroeconomic study, we are very much interested in what goes on. And we'll be coming back time and again to talk about normal versus inferior goods and what those relationships are, particularly since they impact the business cycle. By the way, there are some goods that don't always, when we talk about inferior goods, there are some goods that don't often come to mind as being relevant. One of these is alcoholic beverages. Demand for alcoholic beverages goes up during economic downturns because it's considered to be a substitute for other goods that are normal goods. All inferior goods are substitutes for normal goods. And so rather than traveling, maybe people consume more alcohol, maybe people are under more stress, but we know alcohol consumption picks up during economic downturns and goes down during economic upturns. In the 1980s, the late 80s, when the economy was going great guns, alcoholic beverage consumption went way down. In fact, some liquor companies were deciding to merge with each other because their sales were falling. Another one, which is it's known as the lipstick phenomenon, is that cosmetics tend to be an inferior good. People buy more cosmetics during economic downturns than they do during upturns. And that is something I don't think I would have guessed. Of course, I personally, I couldn't say that I built a lot of cosmetics in my time, but you get the idea. That is, in fact, the cosmetics company for that. In fact, that's why they call it the lipstick effect. They know that there's something happening with their demand and with the macroeconomy generally because of that. So sometimes these aren't always obvious as to what's an inferior good and what's a normal good. Okay, so questions for me on that. Okay, what I want to do is this. I want to do a bit of more model building, and I'm going to try to risk, I guess the word is risk, turning the lights back on, because I don't know why they keep shutting off. And I guess there's another room I use for the Attend Anywhere, and I've got a different technical problem there. So I hate to sort of burn my bridge, keep calling people about technical issues that I've got. I don't want to be that guy. I'll be on this side of the room so that I'll be able to capture it. So, okay, so what I want to do, it'll probably take me to most of the hour. I don't think we'll get too deeply into chapter 3. The second model that we're going to be building in the class, and I want to come back once again to talk about this idea of what models are. So we build models because they illustrate relationships, they can simulate effects, they can be used to project things, or more for our purposes to illustrate things. And so the model we're going to talk about here is something known as the production possibilities model. This is discussed in your book, and this will really be, I think, the last topic before we get into demand and supply. And so it'll be very clear what topics we're covering. Production possibilities model. Okay, there go the lights.
You try the one back there, go in the back of the room.
Is there a switch back here? What do you do with it? See, if that helps. Oh, you're right, there was a switch back. Okay, well. I don't know if that's going to do the trick or not, but we'll see. Okay, so production possibilities model. So what are we talking about here? Well, like a lot of models, and we talked about models a bit last week when we first built the circular flow model. We said, what do models do? They simplify reality, and so allow us to really explain things like a blueprint for a house. A blueprint for a house shows you the room sizes, dimensions, the relations to other rooms and doorways and whatnot, but they don't show you every granular sort of detail. So you don't need light switches and you don't need wallpaper and carpeting to show what's going on. If you want that sort of detail, you can drill down into it, but for the most part, it allows you to see relationships by simplifying them. And this gets very simplified in the sense that we're going to talk about from a standpoint of supply and production, how we allocate output. So think about this. This is going to illustrate an important relationship. So we're going to deal with a graph of the first quadrant like this. And remember the origin and the importance of the origin. So I always orient you back to that. Particularly important as we get into chapter 3, because and going forward, really, because as we deal with these first quadrant graphs of positive values against positive values, if something is rising, like a function is rising, it's moving right, it's moving away from the origin. Think of the number line here, which is why I want everybody to think right, left, rather than up, down, because I think it's going to be more useful to you. So that's really the best way to go. So we got this graph. And let's say that we've got the production of two goods. So you've got either a firm or an industry or an economy, even an entire economy produces two goods. And let's just call them for generic purposes, good A and good B. Okay, good A and good B. Okay, so what does it tell us? It tells us that we get choices. We can make some kind of combination anywhere along this with ordered pair relationships. But for the most part, we can say that we're sort of constrained by a downward sloping relationship. Now, remember, we said about slopes, and there was a reason why we got into slopes last time, and that was the idea that there's an inverse relationship between two goods if you've got a downward sloping curve or straight line. That is, one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. If it's positively sloped or sloping upward, it's a direct relationship. It's one thing, one variable goes up, the other variable also goes up and goes down in the same way, in the same direction. But we're going to say the production possibilities model gives us a downward sloping relationship, looks like that. And we simply refer to this particular graph as what we call the PPF, or the production possibilities frontier. Frontier. So it's downward sloping, and it's also concave as opposed to convex. And I'll get to the importance of that here in a second. Okay. So this is discussed in your book, but I think sometimes just turning your list to a book is not really adequate sometimes to describe what's going on. So what we're saying is this, that along this, first of all, along this curve, which we call a frontier, we can produce various combinations of output. We can produce this combination of B and this combination of A, this combination of B, this combination of A, should be this combination of A. But we're operating on the frontier. What does a frontier do? A frontier is sort of an outer limit, right? It's a bound. We can't go beyond the frontier. So for years, when aviation was first beginning, we couldn't get into outer space. We just couldn't get there. We didn't have the technical capability. We obviously pushed to that. Then we couldn't get beyond Earth's orbit. We got beyond that. And you get the idea, frontiers are sort of made to be pushed back. But in the short run, at minimum, they're a constraining factor. And so is the case with production. And so if we're operating somewhere on this curve here, where we're operating at some point that we'll call, let's see, point 1 here, which corresponds then to A1, B1, right? A1, B1. And so if we're producing this amount of A, or this amount of A, and this amount of B, well, what if for some reason we want to produce more of good A? And as we do so, we increase the production of good A. Downward sloping, we inherently have to give up some of the production of good B. And that's what a negatively sloped function is telling us. So this is important, okay? Because what's going on here is that we're illustrating a trade-off. And trade-offs are one of the most important concepts everywhere in economics. So trade-off exists. And that is, if I want to produce more of good A, I've got to give up some of good B. Because why? Because I can't devote all the resources I could to, I can't go more A and more B because I don't have the resources to do it. And sometimes people don't always get that you've got to give something up to do something. Sometimes I think we can do it all, we really can't. And as a result, we bump into time. We find out we do nothing very well if we try to do that. And I can recall when I was in the business world one time, we had this idea where management gave us, I was on a task team, management gave us an option of doing, of coming up with 3 recommendations for a particular plan. So we came up with one that they said, that's a good plan. And by the way, your second plan is also good. But if the second plan was also, if it was so good, why don't we just do both? Not realizing, of course, you really can't do both. There's a reason why they gave us the assignment in the first place. Find out what's best, and we'll forego the other one. And that's what a trade-off is a foregoing of something. If I want to do more of something, I've got to give up something of something. And when we refer to this, a trade-off exists. We can put an economic value on it. We can put a dollar figure on it, which we won't do right now, but we'll get to those concepts a bit later. But the economic value of which is known as the opportunity cost. This is an important concept everywhere in economics. I'm running out of ink here. That seems to be a common occurrence. The value, so a trade-off exists, comma, the economic value of which is the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is really a critical concept everywhere in economics, not just macroeconomics, but also microeconomics. And also, it's everywhere around us in life, right? If I do one thing, it means I can't do another thing because I've got to choose my limited resources. So what are the limited resources all of us have? By the way, we're all producers. Right now you're producing value, which would be credit hours, right? That's what you're doing here, I presume, right? If you're here for fun, that's fine too, I suppose, right? But you're here to produce credit hours, that's what you're doing. But because you're here now, those of you who are here in the classroom, those of you watching live, you're also not doing what? That might have economic value. Working. So you're foregoing a wage to be here. Now maybe you're going to go to later or whatnot. That's true. But the fact that you're doing this means you're not at the gym. You're not sleeping. You're not doing something. And I know that morning classes tend to be, students always say, "Oh, I could be sleeping." It's like, well, okay, that's fine. I get that. And that's a good answer, right? Sleeping does have value. And so if sleeping didn't have value, we wouldn't do it, right? But you get the idea. If you're doing one thing, you have to give up something of the other. It's an inherent part of the economic condition. It relates to scarcity. If for no other issue, not just resources in terms of money and natural resources, what about time? Time is one of those things which we've all got the same amount of time per day. Now we all have different lifespans, presumably, but we all have 24 hours a day. It's what we do with our time that's really important. So, and how we make use of that time. So the value that is given up is the opportunity cost. It's a foregone value. So how do we define opportunity cost here, right? So what is the definition of opportunity cost? Because it's going to come up as a fairly common topic throughout the course. It is the value of a foregone opportunity. It's the value of a foregone opportunity. And so as a result of this, if we do one thing, we give up doing something else. And we have to include the value of what we gave up to do that. And I know we used to use a textbook that had a number of different sort of stories and kind of vignettes, I guess, real world examples to try to bring economics home. And there were stories about people who skipped college to go to play pro sports. LeBron James, Tiger Woods, I think, started college and decided to be a pro golfer. And the question, and I know that traditional thinking is that, well, you shouldn't skip college because, every year of college translates to higher lifetime earnings. And that's true, but it's not true for everyone, right? So LeBron James just skipped college altogether to go become a pro athlete. Well, did that work out for him economically? I think it probably did, right? Well, I think it did. Tiger Woods left college to do what he did, and that probably worked out because there was a higher opportunity cost of what he was giving up, just from a purely economic standpoint. Yes, I know that not every decision comes down to economics, but a lot of them do, don't they? a lot of issues, a lot of questions, and a lot of decisions we make have economic bases. And so, by the way, you can always go back to college. It doesn't matter. I mean, we have people at UNM who are, retired, who are doing degrees and whatever, just because they want to do it. So you're not foreclosed from doing that, but you might not ever be able to play pro sports again. So there is a limiting factor there of what you choose to do. And so you have to give up. So giving up college was a smaller foregone opportunity than giving up the wages that could be earned by playing pro sports. And so that's just one sort of example. So back to this model here, if we produce more of one good, we give up producing some of the other good. And if we reverse it, go the other direction and say, rather than say from point 1 to point 2, point 1 is out here, point 2 is there. If we go this direction, and if we want to produce more of good B, we've got to give up some of good A. So it's the very same thing. All we're doing now is reversing the decision. And so now the opportunity cost is what we could have produced in good A to produce more of good B. So that's essentially what's going on there. Okay. It's the value of the opportunity cost that's happening. Okay. Let me see. Oh, where's my little squeeze bottle? It's not here, is it? Oh my God.
Back of the room might switch works better.
What's that?
Back of the room might switch works better.
No, I have to walk because I have to have. I think the little. Oh, okay, never mind. This will work. This will work.
I was just staying on.
Yeah, well, it's This is a. I apologize for the sort of strange setup here, but this board, for whatever reason, these erasers are really not up to the job. I had this squeeze bottle on Tuesday. You might remember that was this class, wasn't it? We had the squeeze bottle.
Yeah.
Which is missing. Somebody took. I don't know who would take off with it, but somebody who needed it more than what I guess we do. Okay, some other things about the production possibilities model. By the way, I mentioned at the outset of this conversation here that this can be applied to a business firm as a producer. Actually, it could be even smaller. I mean, we've talked about the idea of an individual choosing what to do and what not to do. If you've got two choices. And I realize that sometimes there are more than two choices. And by the way, if there are more than two choices, you can simply lay out more graphs, more axes. You can do an infinite number of these axes if you've got multitudes of choices. And in fact, if you ever want to do a higher level economics class, you might be confronted with multiple graphs and multiple axes where you're making these decisions. Obviously, the more variables you include, the more complex it gets. And so my point is not to get more complex, but to keep it as straightforward as possible. So it could be an individual, it could be a business firm, it could be an entire industry, or it could be an entire country. And sometimes, rather than choosing the example good, actually something that's been used in the social sciences for a long time, and that is this idea of guns and butter. Guns and butter. And you may have heard this particular euphemism before. Guns and butter may not necessarily be guns and butter per se. It may not be meant to be construed as literal, but maybe when we talk about butter, what we're really talking about here are consumer goods. That is our economy producing consumer goods that is enough good for the consumption of individuals. What does the term consumption really mean? It means demand for goods for final use by individuals that we are as consumers. All of us are consumers. It's not just consuming things physically, it's also consuming things like services, even consuming government services, right? As opposed to what? Well, as opposed to capital goods. So remember, we got into this discussion last time about what is the definition of the term capital. We said capital goods, or capital is anything which we built upon to produce future value. So capital goods would be things like technology, machine goods, real estate, things that are going to have a life that beyond consumption, and that they're going to be used to build future value. So producing things like runways and roads and rail and fiber optic and hospitals, all these kinds of things are considered capital goods. They're going to have a long life. They have a physical nature that can be built upon to produce future value. And so as a result, if we come back to this idea here, we can say that maybe we're producing more of one thing and not enough of the other. Now, by the way, when we talk about these series of trade-offs, here you've got a trade-off that is sort of equivalent. It's the width of this area here. It looks like the B trade-off is maybe a bit bigger than the A trade-off. But as we get closer to the edges here, where let's say we're producing a lot of capital goods, so A1 and B1, and we're going to produce just a little bit more capital goods here, right? We're just going to produce a little bit more, but we're going to give up a heck of a lot more of B. So the trade-off is not very equivalent. It's not because we're going to give up this much B consumer goods to produce just a little bit more A. And the same works as we go to the other axis. If we were up here where we're producing just a little bit more consumer goods, we're going to give up a lot of capital goods. So what happens is, as we approach these axes, there's a reason why this is concave, which goes this direction. Concave downward sloping curve. It means that we become more vertical as we approach the horizontal, or horizontal as we approach the vertical, meaning that we have an acceleration of cost. In other words, we call that increasing opportunity cost. That these these equivalent trade-offs are not critical. I mean, are critical, and that they become more pronounced as we commit more of one thing and give up something of the other. We're over-investing in certain areas. Now, by the way, if you look at this entire area of looking at other economies in the world, there has been criticism of countries that have over-invested in capital goods, particularly, and I mean quite literally, in the guns category. So it's guns is sometimes a euphemism for hospitals and schools and buses and all that. But here, if we take a look at North Korea, one of the real outliers in the global economy, where they're literally producing a tremendous amount of the total output on weapons. They're trying to develop nuclear weapons. It's a hereditary dictatorship, basically, that's not particularly integrated in the rest of the world. And literally, they have been starving their own people to do it. Some estimates are that maybe up to 2 million people have starved to death in North Korea because of this obsession with producing more weapons, which is the literal definition of guns. I don't know how much more you get than that. So that would be an example of a misallocation. It's not efficient from an allocation standpoint. And so when we talk about this mix of goods, somewhere in the middle is more of the sweet spot here, particularly if you're laying it out this starkly between consumer goods like food and healthcare and education versus construction and real estate and weapons and equipment and whatnot. That doesn't necessarily translate in any meaningful or certainly not immediate way to the consumer. Likewise, if you're an economy operating way out here, where you're producing lots of goods and not very much capital goods, then that really impairs your ability to grow in the future. And I'm thinking here particularly of some of the developing world where there's a real high population and where there's just no real ability to produce much in the way of capital goods because they're just doing the best they can to feed everybody, to put food and shelter and to vaccinate people and all these very basic kinds of things. There are a lot of people in the world who are facing that.
As an example of this, like when our government put in money for infrastructure, so that like made that move more towards the capital goods side versus the consumer goods.
Yeah, and I think in our case, what our government was trying to do was to try to invest. The question was about our infrastructure bill, which President Biden had really proposed and campaigned on, and eventually got some pared down version. I think his wish list didn't quite get fulfilled by the Congress, but it was an idea that sometimes it's important to invest in long-term assets like infrastructure and whatnot. And here's the problem that goes back to the example of the developing world. They just can't do it because every amount of increase in consumer goods means they give up the opportunity to produce things like things that would help them grow their economy, like dredgeable harbors where they could dock ships, rail lines, telecommunications, water systems, electrical systems. They're in a lot of cases, a lot of places in the world sorely lacking. And water systems, that's a fairly basic thing. And so as a result, they're operating too much. Their allocation is too much toward consumer goods. And this goes to really a problem throughout the developing world is that, yes, there's a population problem, but it's not so much a population problem as it is a distribution problem. We've got too many people in the world living in the wrong places. And I know it's easy for me to say, and it's not easy to move people. And in fact, it's considered very inhumane to move people, but that's what the economic circumstance where people are faced with. And in fact, they will likely move on their own. at some point under very difficult conditions. It's simply a misallocation issue, okay? All right, one final thing, and it has to do with this. There is some good news here, and that has to do with this idea of what is the long term. So let's look at more of a long-term implication. I've got about 4 minutes, but I should have enough time to do this, and that is this idea of what do we do? What about the long? So when we talk about this eggs and butter or good A, good B, we'll just go back to A and B just to keep it sort of simple here. And we've got a here, and let's say that we're producing somewhere out here on the curve. Now, by the way, if you're already here, right? If you're already here, you're operating in a suboptimal condition, right? And anytime you're operating inside this, this is what we simply refer to in macroeconomics as a term we all are familiar with. It's unemployment, right? How do we define unemployment as a macroeconomic concept? It's the underutilization of resources. I know that sounds like a very sterile, sort of inhuman, robotic way of looking at it, but economists look at not only labor unemployment, which is what we tend to focus on, and in truth, we will focus mostly on labor unemployment when we talk about unemployment. But I do want to emphasize that unemployment also extends to the underemployment of all resources, where plants that were operating 24 hours a day on 3 shifts are now down to 2 shifts, simply because of poor business conditions, because the economy is not operating to its potential. Not that there's not a willingness, but there's just not the ability. Or wages are falling because there's not enough demand for the goods that these workers are producing. So anytime you're operating inside this curve, it's a condition of unemployment. And that's considered to be a suboptimal condition. And we're certainly going to talk about it from the labor standpoint, but I just want to sort of make this definition here as any unemployment sort of broadly construed is really an underutilization of resources that operating in any combination here is considered full employment. Full employment. And we're going to get more concrete as to what the definition of full employment is. Now, here's the good news. Over time, rather than being faced with the very short run condition where we're faced with some A1, B1 combination, it is a possibility for the economy to push back the frontier through technology, through understanding and better trade, improved business outlook, better educated population. So as a result, what happens is you can sort of walk this way. And so as a result, you get not just more A, but also more B, more A, more B, more A, more B, more A, more B, all the way as we push this back. And so we're extending the frontier. And this phenomenon is simply known as economic growth. And that is one of the main goals of macroeconomics, is to achieve, in the long run, economic growth. Now, we'll sort of modify that a bit by saying non-inflationary economic growth. So particularly resilient topic at the moment, because we've got some inflation going on. We've got lots of growth going on. We really do. Our economy is really robust, but we're paying for it a little bit with inflation. So, but we'll get to that a bit later. For right now, let's just talk about this idea, pushing the frontier back through improvements in technology, transportation, knowledge, and all that can allow the pie to get bigger. And by the way, the evidence is overwhelming that it is possible to do. If you go back 40 years, the economy was about $4 trillion of output, and the economy was about 200 million people in the US. Today, it's 6 times the size. It's $24 trillion, and our population's only gone up by 50%. 600% increase in output, 50% increase in population. It's a pretty good trade-off. Now, it's not all evenly allocated. I get that. That's an issue for another day, but it is possible to grow the economy. And there are occasions in which you can simply outgrow your problems. And that's a happy circumstance. So economics sometimes doesn't always get the reputation for giving good news, but this is, for those who believe that economic growth is a good thing, this is some good news. It's not trouble-free, it's not problem-free. We'll certainly talk about that, but I think it is evident that it is possible. So are there questions for me? Because I think I'm about almost out of time here. Okay, well, I'll do my best to get this posted into to a YouTube link, and I'll get that for you. I also need to get Tuesdays found. It's got to be on this computer somewhere, and I'll get that available. We'll get into chapter 3, and we'll talk about the first exam, and we'll get more details about that. So Everybody have a great weekend and I'll see you next week.